Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light for Famicom. This is a rather early example of a tactical JRPG developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo in 1990 for the Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the NES if you're not familiar with it. And while this would eventually go on to spawn a very long-running franchise that still exists to this day and is actually one of Nintendo's most popular franchises now, at the time this original Fire Emblem game released, that wasn't so certain. The critical reception was actually pretty lackluster at best. A lot of criticism was leveled at it for being hard to understand and just not being all that impressive visually. But as is sometimes the case, what the players were saying was pretty different from what the critics were saying, and word of mouth continued to spread for the game until eventually sales did start to pick up. The initial lackluster sales eventually gave way to actually being a pretty decent success for Nintendo, and they did eventually decide to fund development of a follow-up, which would become Fire Emblem Gaiden, and basically the rest is history at that point, at least as far as continuing the Fire Emblem series goes. But Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light goes beyond simply being the progenitor of the Fire Emblem series. It was also credited as being directly influential for games like Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics, and would go on to be one of the founding influences of the entire tactical JRPG genre, although it being exclusive to Japan until the 2008 DS remake called Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon made it not as influential in Western games. In fact, the West would remain largely ignorant of the Fire Emblem series until Super Smash Bros. Melee came out and included two characters from the series in it, specifically Roy from Fire Emblem 6, also known as Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, and much more important for this particular video, Marth, who is actually the main character of this game as well as Mystery of the Emblem. That helped to drum up interest in the series, and eventually Nintendo would bring the Fire Emblem series to the West with 2003's release of Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, simply called Fire Emblem in the West, and from then on out Nintendo would release every subsequent game in the Fire Emblem series in the West, with the exception of the second DS title, which was Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. It's a remake of Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. But as I mentioned before, the original game, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, would not make its way to the West until they remade it on the DS and simply titled it Shadow Dragon. And between the release of that and the release of this, there were 18 years of development in the Fire Emblem series, so Shadow Dragon is a very different game from Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Obviously, this being a very early example of a tactical JRPG, it's going to be very primitive compared to the Fire Emblems we're playing now. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and see where the series got its roots, as well as how well this game in particular still holds up. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which I do need to mention something important about. Most of the footage you're going to be seeing here is actually of the original Famicom version, not the version that was made available on the Switch. The reasons for this are quite simple. First, I actually started working on this video long before the Switch version was even announced, and thus the footage I have is almost exclusively of the original Famicom version. And second, they actually screwed up the color palette in the Switch version. For some utterly baffling reason, it is quite a lot darker and more muted than the original Famicom version. I have no idea why they did that, but it makes the game look a lot uglier than it actually is. Of course, to be fair, even for an NES or Famicom game, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light was really never much of a looker anyway. It is certainly functional for the type of game it is, so it's not as big of a problem as you would see with some other games that are meant to be a bit more impressive, but at the same time, the very limited color palette and the rather undetailed sprite work just don't look very good and certainly don't hold up all these years later. Not to mention that this being one of the earliest examples of a tactical JRPG, the interface is extremely primitive to say the least, to the point where even some of the most basic features that you would see in later Fire Emblem games are just not even here. For example, if you go to play any modern Fire Emblem game, you will see that whenever you select a unit, it will show a selection on the grid where that unit can move and of course where it can attack. That wouldn't be a feature of the series until the third Fire Emblem Emblem game, Mystery of the Emblem. And as another example, when you go into combat between two units, you'll see that the hit chance, attack power, and defense power are bars rather than numerical values like you would see in the later entries. It's just a messy way of handling the interface, and while it is certainly functional and you can get the gist of it, it does make it pretty obvious where those complaints of the game being hard to understand came from. And while it is fairly easy to cut it some slack for being not only a 30-year-old game at this point, but also one of the earliest examples of a game in its genre, unfortunately that is one of the biggest factors in making this game very difficult to go back to. Thankfully, the sound design doesn't contribute to that, because generally speaking, for an NES or Famicom game, it sounds perfectly reasonable. The sound effects themselves are the beeps and bloops you would expect for the era, and there's nothing really egregious there. And of course, this being a Famicom game, there's no voice acting in the game at all. But then of course, there's the soundtrack, which is quite good overall, although later games in the series would definitely do a much better job with it. Most of the tracks in this are pretty decent 8-bit tunes, and there are of course two tracks that are pretty iconic for the entire series at this point, those being the main title theme, which has gone on to become the main theme of the entire series, as well as dialogue theme number 2, which unfortunately has only been used in one subsequent Fire Emblem game, that being Fire Emblem 7, where you would know it as Together We Ride, though ironically enough, I think most people these days know it more from being in Super Smash Bros. Than from actually playing the Fire Emblem games that included it. At any rate, the rest of the soundtrack is mostly forgotten at this point, and while some of the tracks are basically nails on a chalkboard, like the shop theme, which is just horrible to listen to, the majority of tracks are fairly simple and straightforward and get the job done reasonably well, although you do get the feeling at times that they were limited by the hardware. So while the soundtrack still holds up reasonably well for the most part, and some of those tracks have gone on to become rather iconic for the series, the majority of the presentation in Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light does leave a lot to be desired, and it does not hold up very well at all. But of course, as rough as the presentation is on modern eyes, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is the beginning of what would become known as the Arcania series, which consists of this game, Fire Emblem Gaiden, Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, and oddly enough, much later on, Fire Emblem Awakening. And while Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light does certainly have a fair bit of story for a Famicom game considering what they had to work with in the hardware department, you only really get story at the beginning and end of a given chapter. In between those, it's just all combat. You also have to keep in mind that when people talk about the story in this particular game, most of the time they're actually talking about the remake, which does pretty heavily expand upon what this game does, also including elements that were expanded upon already in Mystery of the Emblem. Because in case you didn't know, Mystery of the Emblem is split into two parts, Book 1 and Book 2, and Book 1 is an abridged remake of this game. So what is the story that the remake and sort of remake would expand upon? Well, the idea is that the forces of the Empire of Dolour are sweeping across the continent and slowly taking everything under their banner, whether that be through diplomacy and just offering deals to certain kingdoms, or outright conquest. And among these machinations, the Kingdom of Altea ends up getting attacked by its longtime allies, the country of Gra, their neighbors, which leads to the death of Altean King Cornelius and the capture of Princess Elise. She actually ended up sacrificing herself so that her brother Prince Marth could escape, and the events of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light follow the exploits of Prince Marth a few years after these events, where he is amassing an army so that he can rescue his sister, reclaim the Kingdom of Altea, and ultimately bring the fight to Emperor Medius, the Emperor of Dolour, which is ultimately going to require him to seek out the legendary sword Falchion, which is a magical sword that is basically the only thing that can actually harm Medius. And along the way, he'll find plenty of allies in the form of people who are already fighting against the Empire of Dolour, and when he shows up, they see a potential strong ally, so they join up, or people who are already under attack, and Marth swoops in to save the day, and they end up joining out of gratitude, among other things, or even certain characters that start out as enemies and can be persuaded to come over to Marth's side. The thing is, with the exception of a handful of characters that are rather significant to the plot, the vast majority of these characters only have the recruitment dialogue, and then you never really hear from them again. They just make up soldiers in your army, which is a bit disappointing if you've played later games, where the characters are, well, actually characters as opposed to just units. And that lack of interesting characterization and the general lack of interesting dialogue in the game means that the vast majority of what you're going to be reading throughout this game is some rather dry descriptions of what's been going on and what everything means, but it really only ever gives you the bare minimum of what you need to know where you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing it. Now, of course, for a Famicom or NES game, that's pretty reasonable. Most games of that era didn't have much in the way of story or characterization at all, unless they were on PC, which generally had more hardware resources available than consoles did, at least by the time you got to 1990 anyway. When you're talking about the early days of the Famicom and NES, that was a very different story. And while this is one of the earliest examples of a tactical JRPG, and we don't really have a whole lot to compare it to around the time it was released, there were other role-playing games and, of course, JRPGs coming out around that time. I mean, to give you an idea, the same year we got the original Final Fantasy III, the one for the Famicom, we got Wizardry 6, Bane of the Cosmic Forge, and we got Ultima 6, The False Prophet. It's basically right on that cusp of when role-playing games and JRPGs started to get a lot more heavily involved with story and characters, and a lot less involved with just purely being about mechanics. So compared to its contemporaries in the role-playing game and JRPG genres, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light is certainly a bit weak in the story department, and especially in the characters department, but it's not so much weaker than its contemporaries to where it really makes all that much of a difference. It's only in looking back at it that it really starts to become more of a problem. And that's an issue that extends to the gameplay mechanics as well, because this is of course the very first Fire Emblem game. They didn't have everything codified for the series yet, and more importantly, it's one of the earliest examples of its entire genre. They hadn't quite figured anything out yet. So how does Fire Emblem 1 play, and how much of that remains intact today? Well, actually not all that much of it remains intact. The broad strokes are certainly there. Everything still takes place on a grid, each unit occupies a single space, and the gameplay takes place in a turn-based format where the player takes a turn and then the enemy takes a turn, and you're going to be moving your units around the map to take advantage of different terrain bonuses, as well as move units into positions where they can block access to other units, and of course you will also be able to take advantage of equipment bonuses. For example, hammers are particularly good against armored knights as well as cavaliers, whereas bows are particularly effective against Pegasus knights. You will find that each character class is restricted to using certain weapon types, and it might not be what you're used to from later entries in the series. For example, knights in later entries in the series typically only use lances, whereas in this, they can actually use lances or swords. And speaking of things that serious fans might be expecting but be surprised by, this actually doesn't feature the weapon triangle. Sure, there are still axes, lances, and swords, but the weapon triangle, where swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords, is actually a mechanic that was introduced in later entries in the Fire Emblem series, specifically Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War. In fact, nearly everything that makes modern Fire Emblem what it is was introduced in later entries in the series, and the only thing you're really going to be able to recognize in the original Fire Emblem are the most bare-bones basics of mechanics. The stats of strength, skill, speed, luck, defense, resistance, and movement are all present and accounted for, although you will find that basically none of the characters have any resistance, and the only way you can increase it is through the use of talisman items. In addition, there is absolutely no stat scaling for magic in this game, so even though most characters don't have any resistance and thus magic will just blast through the defenses like it's nothing, the amount of damage a spell does is based purely on the base damage value of whatever the tome is. This is simply because, unlike in later entries in the series where there is actually a magic stat that does help to scale the damage, there's no such stat in Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. There's just strength, which does help to increase the amount of damage a physical attack does, but it doesn't do anything for spells. As for the stats that do exist, with the exception of hit points, all of them max out at 20 in this particular game, and unlike in later entries in the series where you can promote your units from the base class into an advanced class and it will give them a big stat boost upon the promotion to the new class, there's no such stat bonus when you promote a class from base to advanced in this, so you just go from that class to the new class. On top of that, only certain classes can promote. Specifically, archers can promote to snipers, mercenaries can promote to heroes, mages and curates both promote to bishops, cavaliers promote to paladins, and Pegasus knights promote to draconites. All of the other classes, which are lords, knights, hunters, ballisticians, horsemen, thieves, generals, and freelancers, don't promote at all. They are only stuck with their base class, and when they hit level 20, they have maxed out entirely. As for the classes that can promote, in order to do so, they have to be at least level 10, and they also need to have a specific item for each class to be able to promote. To give you an example, mages and curates need a bishop's ring to promote to bishop, and mercenaries need a hero crest to promote to hero, so on and so forth. The thing is, leveling up a character to the point where they can promote to the new class is not exactly an easy task, because the way experience point generation in this works is rather odd. You see, experience points are generated on a one-to-one basis with the amount of damage a unit inflicts upon another. So for example, if a unit inflicts 20 damage on another unit, then they get 20 experience points, whereas if they inflict no damage on it, then they get no experience. Similarly, if an enemy does damage to one of your units, that unit will get a small amount of experience based on the amount of damage it took, but then of course there's the elephant in the room. What about curates? They have absolutely no offensive capabilities whatsoever. They can only use stabs, which are used to heal or to warp a unit to a different location on the map or something like that. How do they get experience? By getting clobbered in the face. That's right, the only way a curate can earn experience points is by taking damage. And they are extremely squishy, so you do not want them taking damage. Because when a character hits 0 hit points, they're dead. It's no knocked out and they'll come back in the next chapter. It's not, oh, they get put into a dying state and then they can be revived by a cleric or something. No, it is full stop permadeath. If a unit hits 0 HP, they're dead, they're not coming back, and you have to deal with that. This raises the stakes quite heavily, and it means that certain battles, when they are going poorly and you manage to turn them around, can be pretty exhilarating, but at the same time, when things go poorly for you, whether an enemy gets a lucky crit in and just insta-gibs one of your guys, or you end up getting ganged up on by a bunch of enemies all attacking the same unit and they just whittle it down to nothing, that can get incredibly frustrating. Because while you do have a fairly significant roster of characters, they're unlocked very gradually, so you might not have a ready replacement for whatever character you lose, and it might prompt you to want to restart the chapter so you end up not losing them. The thing is, if that unit that got clobbered happens to be Marth, then you get game over anyway and you have to restart the chapter regardless. The thing is, while in later entries in the Fire Emblem series that's just annoying, in Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light it can become positively infuriating because this game is agonizingly slow. I mean, to give you an idea, I got my start in the Fire Emblem series with the GBA games, so in a chapter from one of those, or a chapter from a more recent Fire Emblem game, it'll normally take me about 20 minutes or so to finish. Meanwhile, with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, there is not a single chapter in the entire game that has taken me less than 35 to 40 minutes. And it's not because of the map size or needing to think a whole lot, it's because all of the animations and all of the computations in this are just painfully slow. Whenever you go through the enemy phase, it has to sit there for several seconds before it even does anything at all. And when it does do something, you have to watch the cursor move over the map to select somebody so then they can go do something. Whenever any unit moves on the map, it moves very slowly. When you have combat animations enabled, you can see for yourself that they're rather slow. And while in the original Famicom version, the only thing you can do to try to speed up this process is disable the combat animations entirely, which still doesn't speed up the game all that much. In the Switch version, at least, you can set the speed of the game to up to 2x, but the thing is, instead of it just setting the particular speed of the movements and such to 2x, it speeds up the entire game, including all of the sound effects, so it just ends up being ridiculous. Now, those of you who've watched my videos for a while know I'm not opposed to slow-paced games, and in fact, in a lot of cases I tend to prefer them, but this particular game is not the good kind of slow-paced, and it just ends up getting incredibly boring or outright frustrating extremely quickly. And when you combine that incredibly slow pace with the rather primitive mechanics, as well as the unintuitive and clunky interface, you end up with a game that is extremely difficult to go back to. I know people like to give me crap for using this phrase an awful lot, but this game is truly archaic for its genre, and it feels like it. I mean, it's even down to weird things like ballisticians being basically just heavy archers in this with the exact same range as normal archers, whereas in later games they would do the much more sensible thing of making ballisticians have considerably longer range than basically any other class. Or even the weird way they have item storage set up where you have to go to the storage tent in order to deposit or withdraw items, and every deposit costs you 10 gold, whereas every withdrawal doesn't cost anything, and you're only prompted to send an item to storage during normal gameplay when you happen to take out an enemy and whatever unit you took them out with already had 4 items in their inventory, and that new item just ends up getting sent to storage. In fact, if a unit has 4 items, it can't even buy anything at a store at all. It has to deposit one of those items in the storage first, or give it to another unit, in order to be able to buy anything at the store. And while things like that are just mild annoyances on their own, they do add up, and when you bring the entire game together, it's almost impossible to see Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light as anything other than a historical curiosity at this point. Sure, it's really interesting to see where the Fire Emblem series came from, where it got its roots, and you can very easily pick out elements that were the basis of what would ultimately become the core mechanics of the series. But to actually go back and try to play Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light is just miserable. And even the features of the supposedly enhanced Switch version really don't help it out all that much. That 2x speed boost is certainly appreciated, but the way they go about it is incredibly lazy, and it just ends up making the game pretty ridiculous. And while it does have a bookmark feature, which is basically save states, that's really a bandage type solution. It's not going to get to the core of what's really wrong with Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, and that wouldn't happen until we got the full-on remake, which was just titled Shadow Dragon. It considerably overhauled all of the mechanics, it made everything considerably more accessible, it includes a tutorial, it expands the story, and it even includes some extra content. So if you're just looking to play through the storyline of Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light because you want to know the story of Marth, then just go play Shadow Dragon. But if you're looking into this purely for the historical value, or you just want a nostalgia trip because you happened to play this a really long time ago, I really can't recommend going back to it. It's one of those games that just has not aged well at all, to the point where it becomes pretty miserable to try to play it again. And while it is nice that Nintendo did make it available for the first time in the West with an official translation, although it's 30 years too late at this point, unfortunately Nintendo decided this would only be a limited time thing, and it's only going to be available on the Switch store until March. I have absolutely no idea why Nintendo thinks this is acceptable, but making a digital download game only available for 3 months, and more importantly, that game being 30 years old, is just absurd. I mean, I know Nintendo is a huge fan of artificial scarcity, much to the chagrin of literally everybody who likes their games, but pushing artificial scarcity into the digital download market is just downright obnoxious. But regardless of whether or not Nintendo rethinks their decision and actually does the right thing for a change, I still cannot remotely recommend going back to Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light when Shadow Dragon, the remake on the DS, exists and is much more playable instead. Unless, of course, you are purely going into it for the historical curiosity value, in which case, go for it. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.